Well, good afternoon. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and thank you all for joining us for this session on cyber war. It's probably the most overused term out there because most cyber conflict is really a short of war kind of conflict. In fact, what makes cyber so potent and what makes it so easy to use is the very concept that you can do it without triggering a war. And so while we are all tempted at times to do comparisons to the last big weapon that changed the way the world thought about conflict among superpowers, the comparisons between nuclear and cyber frequently mislead as much as they help us along. Nuclear weapons were big and expensive. You could go into a cave in Colorado and see where everything was being launched from. You knew exactly who your opponent was. You could build deterrent systems like mutually assured destruction on the assumption that your adversary knew that if they struck you, you could strike back. Cyber is almost the complete opposite from a strategic viewpoint. It's inexpensive. It's so cheap, in fact, that it's much more tempting to use than many other kinds of weapons, even kinetic weapons that are a lot less dramatic than nuclear. Cyber is hard to attribute, although, as we'll discuss in a moment in the North Korean context, there was attribution fairly fast, and we'll talk about why that was. But the fact of the matter is that in the Cold War, the nuclear adversary was either going to be the Soviet Union, or maybe China, or the United States, or one of its allies. You knew that there was a very small group holding on to the weapons. In cyber, it's anything but small. It can be state actors, it can be patriotic hackers, as we have seen in the case of Russia and to some degree in China. It can be criminal groups, as we saw with the attacks on Target and Home Depot. It can be teenagers. And this is one of the reasons that the kind of arms control discussions that we had about nuclear simply don't work when it comes to cyber. I don't know about in your households, but the teenagers in my households don't sign treaties. So all of these make it a whole lot more complex. And then you layer on top of that what we discussed this morning when Josh Ramo made the point that the networking capability has the power to change almost all of the power relationships that we're accustomed to. I often try to think about cyber as a form of three-dimensional chess, where at the bottom you've got your traditional conflict between state actors, and in the middle level you've got the kind of conflicts that Jim Steinberg was talking about before, the sort of conflicts among non-state actors. I think that he referred to it as something that went back to sort of a pre-Westphalian period. And then on top of that, on the top layer of the chessboard, of the three-dimensional chessboard, think of cyber as something that enables you to change all of the activity on the other two levels. So it really mixes things up. And fortunately, we have a panel today that will sort it all out for you. By the time you're done with this, you'll have no more questions about cyber, or we will have stunned you into silence. So we've got Dr. Van Jackson, who's a visiting fellow at the Center for New American Security. And from 2009 to 2014, he worked for the Office of Secretary of Defense as a strategist and policy advisor on the Asia Pacific. He was the senior country director for Korea and the working group chair for the U.S. Republic of Korea Extended Deterrence Policy Committee. And he has a book coming out, can't forget to mention that, Rival Reputations, Coercion and Credibility in U.S.-North Korea Relations. Immediately to his left, your right, Dr. Park No-young, the professor in the School of Law and director of the Cyber Law Center at Korea University, and the president of the Society for the East Sea, commissioner of the Korean Media Rating Board, and vice president of the Korean Society of Mediation Studies. He was also a trade negotiation advisor. Dr. Michael Raska is a research fellow in the Military Transformations Program at the School of International Studies in Singapore. He lectured at the Command and Staff College, also for the Singaporean Armed Forces. And his most recent writing was Military Innovation in Small States, Creating Reverse Asymmetry. And then down at the other end of the stage, Dr. Ren Lin, who's an assistant professor in the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She was a research fellow in the Global Economic and Strategic Center and chaired National Social Science Fund project on emerging countries' participations in global governance. And of course, when it comes to cyber, global governance is where it's at. Van, let me start with you. So, of all of the different cyber attacks that we have seen, none has captured the imagination of people more than the attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment. And it attracted their imagination for several reasons. One, even those who knew that North Korea had a cyber capability didn't really believe they were up to this, which is why when the United States attributed this to North Korea, many disbelieved President Obama. Secondly, this was an explicitly political attack. Unlike most of the cyber attacks we see, it wasn't intended to steal money, steal passwords, gain access. It was intended to make a point in the way that we've only seen in the destructive attacks, say, that Iran did on Saudi Aramco or on the Sands casino in Las Vegas, or that North Korea did here in the Dark Soul attacks. Thirdly, I think it's fair to say that this appeared to be one of the few cases where the United States not only was able to do the attribution fairly quickly, and we wrote in the Times that was because the NSA got up inside North Korean systems as early as 2010, but also because they were willing to declare what that attribution was. So my question to you is this. First of all, do you believe this was North Korea? And secondly, if you do, what does that tell you about how the North Koreans are thinking about the use of cyber? And compare it to how they think about the kind of power they get out of their nuclear weapons program.
That's a good question. So, first of all, I do believe that the attack on Sony was from North Korea. I think Sherlock Holmes would have thought that the attack on Sony was from North Korea, right? This is a matter of deduction. Where's the motive, right? So you don't even need the forensics. You need the forensics to persuade people, right? To persuade the Chinese, to persuade skeptics. But who else has a motive to attack Sony, right? The alternative explanations just didn't strike me as credible. And that is telling in itself, because as new a domain as cyber is, there are some things that don't change, right? And so when we look at cyber, when we look at North Korea's behavior in cyberspace, we still have a need to discern motivations. If we care about deterrence, if we care about defense, if we care about preventing certain kinds of actions, it's important to try to understand what the logic of the action is. And this is one of the challenges for North Korean behavior in cyberspace in particular, because North Korea has shown that it doesn't treat cyberspace as a space that's distinctly a military domain, or uniquely for economic purposes, or uniquely for criminal activity, right? North Korean behavior in cyberspace serves multiple purposes and for multiple goals, and ultimately for us to prevent something, we're going to have to understand what they're doing. And the challenge is that sometimes it may be checking multiple boxes at the same time, and that makes deterrence really hard, because is it an economic logic or is it a security logic? So looking ahead, how does the US government, how does the South Korean government try to do that? And I think they try to do it right now by first classifying, is this a military attack? Is this a terrorist attack? Is this an active, economic espionage, or are you just selling malware on the deep web? Then you can formulate a response. The problem with that is these activities happen on a timescale that makes a response very difficult. And so as we're organized to respond based on detecting which logic is at play, ultimately we're going to be too slow. And so unless, in the event that there's an actual crisis, it's going to be very difficult to respond in a timely way.
Well, Van, let me ask you about that, because think about this. It was the North Koreans got into the Sony system in September. We didn't detect it initially. Sony certainly didn't detect it. The attack was November 24th. The president's accusation that, and the Situation Room meeting where they determined to publicly go after North Korea was December 18. The president talked about it December 19th. And then the U.S. issued sanctions on January 2. Okay? So it was basically, if you go from attack to sanctions, it was 6 or 7 weeks, which, as you know from your days in the Defense Department, that's lightning speed in Washington, right?
Yeah.
But tell me, did that response, to your mind, create the kind of deterrent effect you would need for a North Korea using cyber for this multiple group of events that you're talking about?
Well, so I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't sanction North Korea for these kinds of behaviors, but we can't expect that to change its behavior. There's sanctions to the hilt already, right? So, if we do something to make us feel better, or to reinforce that this is proscribed behavior, that's one thing, but that's different from what are we going to do to actually change their behavior.
So what would you have suggested we might do, or the president might do, to have actually changed behavior? Because I'm with you. Those sanctions look to me like, at the meeting the next week in North Korea, somebody said to Kim Jong-un, well, it's just another set of American sanctions. We've been looking at those since 1952.
Yeah, well, so, I think I see Sid Seiler in the audience. So it's one thing to deconstruct the problem and say why things are bad. It's another thing to suggest a real solution. And so I'm definitely going to fall short there. But with North Korea, the cyber attack fits a larger historical pattern of North Korean provocations. The Sony hack specifically, not all North Korean hacking fits that pattern. But the pattern is North Korea issuing threats for months in advance. They didn't hit Sony wham boom out of the blue. They warned Sony executives. There was a warning trail. The problem was we dismissed it because there's a signal noise problem with North Korean threat making. It's really hard to know when they're saying something that's credible and when they're saying something that's garbage.
Okay, well, Sid's on a panel tomorrow, so we won't let him off on that topic. Let me ask you, Dr. Park, so at the end of the North Korean set of events, President Obama gave some interviews, and he was asked whether this was an act of cyber war. And he said, no, this was an act of cyber vandalism. Now, that's pretty interesting, because usually there isn't a national government response, as we just discussed here, to acts of vandalism. Acts of vandalism are usually left to the local police to handle. So tell us, from your perspective and from a South Korean perspective, was this cyber vandalism? Was it cyber war? And compare it to those Dark Soul attacks that took place 2 years before, where there were the attacks here on the media organizations and the banks.
Yes, you mentioned in the beginning, the term cyber war is overused. So I'm very much concerned about this kind of use, because cyber war in the term cyber war, makes people think in a wrong way. Then last week, the US Department of Defense published cyber strategy. It is very useful. If allowed, I'm going to mention several times in this session, but the DoD cyber strategy mentioned that North Korean hacking against Sony Pictures was one of the most destructive cyber attack against the US. Nevertheless, the US president describes North Korean act was not an act of war. It is just, as you mentioned, cyber vandalism. I think Mr. Obama correctly approaches those kind of cyber attacks in a very careful way, because the term cyber war was generally said to be coined by the two American authors in 1993. Their publication was Cyber War is Coming. But the two authors clearly and correctly thought about cyber war in a military context, not in a general anything relating to cyber attack, to anything. So I'd like, in the beginning, we should be careful in using the term cyber war. And in that sense, Mr. Obama was correct to describe North Korean hacking not as a cyber, kind of act of war, but just vandalism.
So, Mr. Park, let me ask you, Van pointed out that the reaction to the Sony attack was to impose some sanctions, similar to what the United States has done against China for its activities with Unit 61398, and we'll ask Ren Lin about that in a moment. But when the attacks occurred on the banks and on the media companies 2 years before, what was the South Korean action against North Korea in response?
That's a very good question. And I believe Korean government should have done anything against North Korea after blaming North Korean.
But they did nothing.
I think we should see it as a kind of a strategic way. So I'm not sure about what Korean government did.
They certainly didn't announce anything, did they?
But do you remember that Mr. Obama mentioned about North Korea collapse?
Mm-hmm.
Not blocking the internet to North Korea, but actually making North Korea more, freer by free connection to North Korea through internet. That is a kind of information security. But we just usually think about how to retaliate, how to sanction by blocking the internet, by blocking communications. So I'm not sure, but I think Mr. Obama,
He did, but of course, North Korea's got at least 1,024 IP addresses that we know of in any case, which is fewer than you would find on most blocks in Manhattan. So, as we know, there's an internal internet where people can only see what's happened in North Korea. But what you're suggesting is that the best response would be to actually bring internet service in a larger way to North Korean people.
of course.
Hard to do.
Because actually I'm not a specialist in how to do it, but the North Korea, China, and Russia, they speak about not cybersecurity, but information security. They are very much concerned about the contents, like in the Facebook or Twitter, because the free content make their regime going down.
Okay, let me skip over to Ren Lin and ask her, because she spends a lot of time thinking about the logic of these behaviors back and forth. So China's in a very odd position with North Korea here, where on the one hand, China is a traditional ally. On the other hand, there's some evidence, including the interference that North Korea's cyber connections through China suffered soon after the Sony attack, that perhaps the Chinese, perhaps an outside power, was sort of disrupting some and trying to send a signal to the North Koreans. So as you hear this discussion, what is it that could be done to change North Korea's behavior in cyberspace, and how would that have fit into the general Chinese view of how one sets norms of behavior in cyberspace?
Actually, every time I hear such questions raised by some peers who's doing like cybersecurity study, I feel a little bit frustrated because the concept of cybersecurity is not so clear. There are lots of discussions after Snowden, the event, and we see lots of frustrations not only from like Korea, from Japan, also from Germany, that everyone is suffering from cybersecurity. But what is cybersecurity? Ms. Merkel is worrying that her mobile phone is detected by the US. She's kind of angry when we say the Spiegel, the newspaper. Is this cybersecurity? And I don't know how many of us sitting here study cybersecurity has ever used Bitcoin and has experienced what is real the cyberspace and what is real feeling terrified because of the cybersecurity problems. Like last year, you might say that eBay has suffered that lots of the account number, also the credit account, and also the name and address has like been hacked. So I don't know, is this also a cybersecurity issue? And how could we define it? Actually, I heard from our colleague sitting here that he might be talk a little bit about the different conceptualization of cybersecurity. But I really want to say, for us as a researcher, as a social scientist, if we study one phenomenon, please stop being say only the phenomenon, but what is behind it. And for us, we are leading the thinking, especially for the think tankers. We are doing the job of conceptualization. If we could, then what could we do in this field? I follow the Sino-American dialogue, the bilateral economic and strategic dialogue. Cybersecurity is a field that is going to be under discussion. That is going to be under discussion in the coming years as well. So I know also here, who's sitting here might be some expert on cyber law. Is there some discussion in the field of law that defines what is exactly cybersecurity?
Let me ask you a specific question that comes out of this, because as you say, in the U.S.-China security dialogue, cyber was raised actually first by Jim Steinberg, who's had to leave us and head back to the States. But I think Jim was the first one to sort of bring that into the U.S.-China strategic dialogue. And then last June, the Justice Department indicted 5 members of the PLA, members of Unit 61398, and charged them with having been the operators who stole intellectual property from some American companies. And the immediate effect of that set of charges was to end the sort of behind-the-scenes conversation that was going on between the United States and China. Now, it may have recently begun to come back to life a little bit, but when you think about the U.S. action there, they were trying to make a point. They were trying to establish some cybersecurity norms, but at the same time, they took an action which ended up freezing that dialogue you just discussed. So tell us a little bit about how you think that should have been handled.
Actually, I'm not expert in the field of law concerning cyber, and today I prepared a paper to talk about the logic in cyberspace. Maybe later I will pull my attention to that topic. But I didn't get what you see.
Well, so the question is, if you're trying to affect behavior in cyberspace, is going in and indicting individual actors, as the U.S. did in the China case, is that a positive step? Does that help reinforce some norms? Or is it a negative step?
What is norms and what is the standard in cyberspace? I heard of two logics that discussed before, like economic logic and the military logic, and maybe probably more as the European Union is reading other logics of in cyberspace. But maybe I actually want to hear real expert in cyber law dialogues, also like concepts of cybersecurity.
Well, Michael, you've been very patient while we have gotten this going, but you spend your time thinking about how Russia, China, South Korea conceive of cyber in their overall strategy. So let's also throw North Korea into the mix since we started off with Sony. Tell us a little bit about what you think we've learned in the past year, because we've got a North Korea case that involved political attacks. We have Chinese cases, which, if you believe the United States, involves a different motive, stealing intellectual property. We have Russian cases that involve both theft and, as I wrote with a colleague of mine over the weekend, a Russian effort to get at President Obama's unclassified emails. I'm not certain how South Korea is envisioning its use of power, so walk us through these country by country.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the Asan Institute and Professor Han for inviting me. I actually like the title, Is the U.S. Back? It sort of appeals to me because I am a graduate of the Yonsei GSIS. So if anybody is here from Yonsei, I can say hi to you, I'm back. But thank you very much for the invitation. When I was at Yonsei, that was maybe 10 years ago, I wrote my master thesis back then on information warfare and the U.S. ROK defense strategy. I mean, back in the 90s, we talked about information warfare narrative was very much an important issue. But what you just highlighted, all these different issues, it shows you basically two things. One is the progressive complexity of the phenomenon, the evolution of the strategies, evolution of the technologies, and the way people think about this. And the problem is, of course, that every country has its own different cyber conceptions. There's no one definition of a cybersecurity or computer network attack, defense, computer network espionage. There's a lot of effort on the European side to come to the terms with the Tallinn Manual and with sort of what the Europeans are doing. But really, the key question is, how can cyber change the strategic landscape in East Asia with all these different examples that we have? So really the key question is, so we have all these different security challenges from conventional to non-conventional. We have a lot of the flashpoints, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, Sino-Japan territorial disputes, East China Sea, South China Sea. What can countries do, or what are they doing to change the strategic outcomes by using cyber means? I think that is the sort of key questions that I have. And in all this conceptualization, each country, we mentioned before, has a different strategies and approaches. China is sort of emulating a little bit of the Russian model, where we talk about sort of the hybrid warfare, sort of another, very popular term these days, again, based on the Russian conceptions. But again, it's the holistic nature where you integrate cyber into multiple other strategies that sort of complement your conventional side. So the Russians and Chinese were viewing influence operations, information warfare, and cyber with electronic warfare, network-centric operations in sort of one asymmetric package that they use, complementing the military means. In the Western world, in the US, it is very interesting to see that cyber is always conceptualized as a separate domain. So you have the Air Force, Navy, right? You have the ground forces, and cyber is supposed to be the fifth domain of using force, in a sense. I would actually rather, lean toward the Asian conceptions of what the Russians are doing, because we cannot really no longer separate cyber from the physical domain. And I think what the North Korean attacks, what all these attacks demonstrate, that North Korea doesn't have only WMDs, but North Korea has also WMEs, weapons of mass effectiveness. And in terms of basically what they are doing, they're combining all the asymmetric forms of warfare that they have, whether it's the WMDs, cyber, and other forms of asymmetric methods, whether it's the sinking of the Chonan, to sort of really offset the conventional inferiority. So this sort of leads to my another point, where you see sort of the cyber-physical convergence, cyber-kinetic convergence, if you will. And really the key question is what the trajectories are and what the civil-military interactions, strategic interactions between the physical and the cyber domain, between the civil and military domains, between commercial, government, intelligence, and all these different domains, how this will evolve.
Well, Michael, let me press you on one element of that. You talk about weapons of mass effectiveness. If you look at the two countries that the United States these days is most worried about in the nuclear arena, it's Iran, given the negotiations that are underway, and North Korea, given the negotiations that are no longer underway, right? Both countries have put an exceptional amount of money into cyber in recent times. Do you draw from that the conclusion that they've both come to the thought that their nuclear arsenals, or their nuclear potential in Iran's case, are fundamentally not terribly effective ways to express power, and that cyber gives them a range of operability that they'll never get out of nuclear, even in the best of days?
Well, of course, it's a very difficult question. What goes on strategic planners in Pyongyang or Iran, I would be probably the last to know. But I can only hypothesize in a sense that it's complementary. Cyber will never replace sort of the potential devastation of nuclear weapons, but it can be used again to create sort of limited type of, it can be used in limited type of wars or limited conflicts with very strong strategic effects. And the fact, for example, South Korea, the United States, and all the other countries that are advanced world are highly interdependent and dependent on IT technologies, not only in the IT sector, but we are talking about really the critical information infrastructure and the processes that control the infrastructure as well. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities that are out there, and because North Korea understands it cannot really match the superior arsenal of the U.S. South Korean forces, it will always look for some type of weaknesses, strategic weaknesses, and I think this is the sort of the next trend where we always talk about cybersecurity, cyber defense, but a lot of these countries are actually moving to cyber offensive capabilities, and the problem is if both countries, if Iran, if U.S. Or if North Korea and U.S. believe they can prevail in some sort of a cyber conflict, that actually increases the risk of escalation.
Well, it raises an interesting point. Let me take that back here to Van from your time in defense. So last week, as Mr. Parks noted, the Pentagon turned out its new cyber strategy. The last one had been in 2011. This one was 3 times longer. It named 4 countries specifically as worried: North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia. It wasn't exclusive to those, but it named those 4. And for the first time, it began to discuss the cyber capability within the United States, including these 133 cyber mission teams, many of which are integrated with ordinary kinetic kind of units, Marines, Air Force, Army, and so forth, which would suggest that we too are moving back towards simply integrating cyber in with the military. So tell us a little bit about what you think the evolution of the U.S. strategy is here.
So the integration piece is important. I think one of the mistakes, Cold War, post-Cold War, was treating nuclear weapons as a totally separate domain and not having that be a part of how we think about sort of military contingencies generally when you're involved in hypothetical conflicts with nuclear states. Big picture, the most notable thing in that defense strategy for cyber was something that Michael alluded to, which is, they didn't use this term, but there's a stability-instability paradox in cyberspace in effect. So like, why have we not seen a cyber Pearl Harbor? Why has there not been a cyber 9/11? These things are possible, right? The logic of the possible tells us that these things could happen. They have not happened. There's still consequences. The logic of consequences still obeys in the cyberspace, as with nuclear weapons. So the devastating effects of cyber are potentially there. They're not realized the same way that nuclear weapons use has not been realized, because the consequence, by whatever mean, of a devastating action is a devastating response. And I think when you're talking about states who have the greatest capacity compared to non-state actors of delivering devastating cyber attacks, there's still a question about motivation and what the likely costs of the action will be. So like if North Korea explodes a nuclear power plant in South Korea, creates havoc, right? Why would that be treated differently than if North Korea had conducted the same effect with a nuclear-armed missile? It should be treated relatively similarly because it's based on the cost, the outcome, the destruction. And so I think that's why we haven't seen the high-level sort of cyber-devastating Pearl Harbor attacks, but at the same time, you're stuck with these, in the strategic sense, ankle-biter issues. And this is the stability and stability paradox. What threats can you make to stop provocations or small actions against a single corporation? It's devastating for the corporation. It puts eggs on our face, but what does that actually, does that change the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula? No, right?
But the lesson of the cyber attacks we've seen so far, and this goes to a behavioral issue that Ren Lin was discussing, is that they're on a rheostat. They're not on an on-off switch, right? So you can dial it down or dial it up to get the effects you want, but try to avoid that kind of retaliation. So when the United States and Israel did the Stuxnet attack in an operation that was codenamed Olympic Games back in 2009, 2010, it went out of its way to make sure that there was not collateral damage on nearby power plants or hospitals, and President Obama talked about that at length in his Situation Room conversations, some of which I've written about at various moments. It strikes me that what you're saying is that in each of the cyber attacks we've seen so far, people could have tried to do a Pearl Harbor, but they made a political decision not to. Is that right?
That's about right. I think one of the challenges that we're facing now is separating what are those cyber operations that are determined by low-level guys. So Kim Jong-un can't decide everything, right? What are those things that are being done to finance discrete operations or for just routine espionage purposes that are being decided by low-level guys, as compared to high-level, directed, politically motivated cyber operations? The distinction matters because that latter category is susceptible, because it's politically motivated and centrally directed, that's susceptible to like concepts of deterrence and diplomacy. So you see in the defense strategy on cyber that just came out, we're starting to talk about deterrence more. Whereas when we first started, like Bill Lynn's former Deputy Secretary of Defense, when he wrote about cyber, he suggested that the logic of mutually assured destruction didn't apply in cyberspace, attribution was impossible. Already, just in a few years, we're looking at a world where, based on the Sony hack at least, we can assume attribution. Forensics are that good. It's just a question of how long it will take. And that really returns us to some of the concepts that helped us survive the Cold War.
So, Dr. Park, let me ask you, in South Korea's case, we know that there is significant offensive and defensive capability. Thanks to Mr. Snowden and some documents that he leaked, we know that South Korea launched a significant effort to get inside North Korea's cyber capability in 2010, and the United States went in right around the same time in a related operation. And yet, when I try to get South Korean officials to talk about their cyber strategy, it's very difficult. I almost hear nothing from them. I hear a lot more from the Chinese, from Ren Lin's associates, who are willing to talk about cyber capability in China than I actually hear from South Korea.
It's a pity. Because, as you know, most developed countries have published and announced their own national cybersecurity strategy. And I asked our government to do so. So by declaring, the Korean government thinks about how to make cyberspace secure and safe in Korea and in the world. But somehow Korean government, I guess, thinks cybersecurity quite critical and delicate, and I mean, it is kind of a matter of national security. So although I recently heard that the Korean government would soon publish a version of kind of national cybersecurity strategy, but so far the Korean government has not yet
They actually
done.
got beaten out by the Pentagon, which is not known as the fastest moving bureaucracy on earth. Yeah, that's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
I mean, very serious, I think.
Yeah. Renlin, tell us, when you hear the Chinese talk about this, you hear them talk, you hear Xi Jinping talk about how China is frequently a victim of cyber attacks. He said that many times. He's talked about the need to establish some norms. But we've never heard Chinese officials talk about those military units that the United States maintains, including 61398, are devoted to cyber within the PLA. Why is that? Why would that be considered to be such a secretive issue, where I would think that China, like the United States, like South Korea, like Singapore, would want to establish some sense of deterrence for attacks on their own systems?
Actually, I will talk from a personal view instead of
Sure.
From my.
We're only asking
from
for
China.
personal views here, yeah.
Actually, I collected lots of ideas because I want to get started with the behavioral logic and also the nuclear weapon, which I want to respond. But basically, I think every country is the victim of a cybersecurity problem. Not only everybody's daily life, but also like the basic important infrastructures, like what if the very important, like a bridge, huge bridge infrastructure would be attacked by the cyber terrorism? Then it's terrible. It's really catastrophic. I think in this term, every country and every individual is the victim of cybersecurity problems. Then I want to transfer to the question of nuclear weapon, because lots of you have discussed, will cyberspace replace nuclear weapon or not? Something yes and something no. But actually, in which terms? Yes, in which terms no? My personal view is that after the first explosion of the atomic bomb, there's there's a thing from American officer that he said the history will be rewritten. The the type of war will be just shifted, will be changed. So lots of IR scholars started to say that there's a deterrence effect of nuclear weapon. So after this, there's a cold peace. Even though it's cold, but it's peace. So the system is somehow with stability, with the nuclear weapon. Of course, it is not good, but this kind of strategic method, will this still function or not in cyberspace? If cyberspace come into the strategic thinking, come into the strategic field, will deterrence and also other methods to deliver information between or among countries function? Such as if a country make a promise, if we bring cyberspace on the table, then this kind of a promise cannot be kept under supervision. Will this country be trusted or not? Also, if there's a cyber attack, and it is hard to figure out the source of the attack. It is hard to figure out attribution, even though the cyber attack is advanced a lot ever since a few years before. Also, like the analysis tech with the big data. So, but basically, we have talked that we need time to figure out what is exactly behind this big data, and how could countries guess each other's ideas when we bring cyberspace on the table. So I read a report from RAND that this report said, if it is hard to make deterrence function, if it is hard to keep the promise under supervision, if it is hard to believe, to trust your counterpart, what will happen? Probably, if there's a cyber attack, the country would prefer instant hate to respond instantly, even though this country might know exactly who is the attacker. And what would this happen? This would upgrade the level of conflicts. Then there will be instability, huge instability. How could we deal with this? I always feel worried as a, quotation marks, social scientist. I remember that Jürgen Habermas had said, for our researchers, social scientists, we should study something which is about the abnormal phenomena in the world. We just understand this abnormal phenomenon, this crisis of the system, and explain to the common people. But today we talk a lot about what is cyber society, what is cyber security. But have we ever thought, how would cyberspace really change the way that we think strategically and also probably in our daily life?
Michael, as you think about each of the different countries as gaining a cyber capability, do you think that they view it as a supplement or ultimately a replacement for more traditional kinetics?
At this stage, it's still very much in the supplement stage, and it's very it's very useful, very convenient in a sense, because the problem of attribution, like you mentioned, the relatively low cost, and you don't need to have army of thousands of cyber warriors. You need to have only 20, 30 guys, a couple of capable units that will sort of give you a very good force multiplier. So I see that as a sort of a force multiplier. It can be very effective. But what is very interesting, again, from my side of things, I look at a lot of strategic planning and open source sort of analysis. Any type of crisis in East Asia, whether it's a conflict between Japan and China over the Senkakus, or the South China Sea, or Korean Peninsula, any type of a spark or any type of a sort of unilateral action or crisis, it will be very much complemented in a cyberspace. So again, that goes to the military doctrines. How would you use it? And basically, I think despite all the different differences in terms of conceptualization, I would argue that cyber attacks would be used on the preliminary stages of conflict, if not even before, to shape, sort of the conditioning the whole battlefield in a sense.
Well, we thought we were going to see that in Ukraine, and in fact, we've actually seen less of it.
Well,
than you would
that's
have guessed.
that's the thing. It's part of the deception in a sense. How do we know what we know, and how do we know for sure that what we know is true in a sense, right? So that's another beauty of using cyber. And despite all the idealist thinking in terms of trying to mitigate the negative factors or sort of find a way to cooperate, I believe that most of the countries out there are really preparing for cyber offensive operations under the stealth cloud of secrecy.
Dr. Park, that takes us sort of back to the South Korean strategy, because developing a cyber strategy to go deal with the North strikes me as a somewhat short conversation, since it's probably one of the least wired societies on Earth. So if you think the United States has got the most vulnerability, Europe, Japan, South Korea have probably the next vulnerability. North Korea's got almost no vulnerability to a cyber attack because the society just is not wired up enough.
So
So tell us how that would affect South Korean strategy here.
actually, I'm not so sure, but if ever cyber attack from North Korea against South Korea reaches the level of use of force or armed attack in international law, then probably we may have to think about self-defense in and through cyberspace, as well as in the physical world, physical space. So that is the one thing, although I'm not want to discuss it publicly, casually. But as you mentioned, the situation in North Korea is not so wired, so that may be their advantage. So in that sense, I, in the beginning, mentioned what Mr. Obama said about how to deal with North Korea. That may be one good way, I think.
Can I jump into that?
Sure.
I think the principal weakness of North Korea again is maintaining control of information, and I think that's something where the information warfare component, this is where they are really sensitive. So if you can respond or retaliate toward a massive cyber attack in the sense that paralyzes South Korea's infrastructure, you can in the same way retaliate against North Korea through an information attack, where you release all kinds of information into North Korea that they are very very sensitive about, and they always sort of threaten a direct kinetic retaliation. So that's one way that you could hit them back, and if you will. The problem is, there's always the idea that, okay, if they have access to information, there will be some sort of internal change. And I think that is a sort of the wrong assumption, because just despite the fact that might have access to information doesn't mean that that will sort of propel or stimulate sort of internal revolt against the North Korean government, if you will. But I think I would argue that they are very increasingly sensitive to or information attacks, and you can do it in the old-fashioned way. I mean, you can stream radio into North Korea to the periphery. The North Korean military cannot jam the entire country. So the periphery, you could argue, is still vulnerable to sort of radio waves, if you will, and sort of use traditional means of information warfare or to sort of respond.
Dr. Park, you look like you had something you wanted to say before we go out to the audience here.
Yes, I'd like to add one thing from the experience in the U.S., because on the first day of April, Mr. Obama announced the executive order sanctioning the hackers abroad. So actually that was the second executive order after the one against North Korea directly. And this I call cyber order that allows the Treasury Secretary to impose those hackers abroad financial sanctions and also visa sanctions. So I think that kind of way is one option for South Korea against North Korea.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and we wanted to go out to your questions here. So if you just raise your hand, and microphone will come to you. Martin, you want to lead us off?
Cyber issues here. Martin Fackler, I just wanted to follow up on something that Mr. Park said. It sounds like you're saying there's a threshold at which a cyber attack could invite a conventional response. And it seems like if you look at the cyber attacks so far, it's almost frustrating because you can't cross that threshold, right? Somehow to escalate beyond, to respond to cyber with something kinetic would be an unforgivable escalation. Is there a threshold already? I mean, will we see that threshold be met at some point?
Was for Dr. Park, I think.
Or
But anybody who wants to take
Mr. Raska, Mr.
I
Jackson,
think
just to the whole
Just very
panel.
quick, I think this is the key question. Where are the red lines? You know, there's a lot of talk about cyber war in a sense, where cyber war actually can kill. That's sort of my, definition in terms of making a damage. But there's a lot of activities beyond that red line that are happening, and they are, which have, in a cumulative aspects, very significant strategic effects. But where are the key red lines? This is a key problem to determine where each country stands.
Van, in the strategy, it said that the Pentagon thought that probably only the top 2% of, I can't remember if this was explicitly mentioned in the strategy or the briefings for us, top 2% of cyber attacks on the United States would rise to the possible level of eliciting a national response. And that's probably even generous, because when you think about the number of significant attacks in the U.S. every day.
No, that's right. But that also suggests that there are some thresholds. We don't know exactly when they are because we don't exactly understand what is motivating a certain behavior, what the likely consequences are. There's a psychological dimension to all of this. And that's what makes it so dangerous. So the idea of Cyber Pearl Harbor, that to me is possible but more laughable than serious. The threat is of miscalculation. Adversaries, competitors, or low-level actors within foreign governments engaging in cyber operations explicitly because they think it's below a threshold and they misjudge. So this is like the classical problem in international relations, except as applied to cyberspace. So engaging in this kind of activity, engaging in any form of this ambiguous sort of gray zone coercion has the inherent risk of inadvertent escalation. And so it's not that cyber kills, it's that the response to cyber kills.
Van, I've just got to point out for the audience that the phrase Cyber Pearl Harbor, while it had been around for a while, was made particularly popular by Leon Panetta in a speech while I'm sure you were still working at DOD, isn't that right?
That's right.
Okay, so you're personally to blame.
I didn't
for that
write
one,
the
right?
talking point.
Okay. He was out that day. Sir.
Senior Colonel Shu from China. Well, I have one comment and two questions. One comment about David, just you mentioned about the normal behavior. I would say the U.S. indictment of 5 Chinese young officers is some kind of that efforts. But I asked my American counterparts, what do you mean by that indictment? Do you think you can bring the 5 guys to U.S. court? They just laugh. Actually, I would say that's try to establish a norm, which means what I do, cyber spying, is we call it military spying. It's okay. But what you do is commercial spying. Is no. For me, that's ridiculous. Just like you can say, you can't do sexual harassment, but rape is okay. And this is my comment. For the 2 questions, I prefer just ask you, Dave. I know you're expert. I read a lot of your reports and your work. So the first question about cyber deterrence. I wonder, cyber deterrence, in what sense it could deter the enemy? It's the same as what the nuclear or something quite different. For that, I would say maybe if there is a North Korean sit here, he would say, okay, what I did to the Sony picture is some kind of retaliation, some kind of deterrence, because you make a picture called interviewing, insult my superior dignity, so we can't afford that, so that's why that behavior. And so do you think that's a kind of a deterrence? A second question about, you asked about why China and South Korea don't talk about the cyber strategy and don't say too much about the cyber military. Here, I would ask you or my friends from the CNUS, do you think the U.S. make so many efforts to build cyber military? Is that serve U.S. interest? I think the whole world should thank Americans. You created a cyberspace which bring the whole world good, so many goods. But now we see you're moving to the opposite trend. You try to make cyberspace a new weaponized, a new battlefield. And we know that if the whole cyberspace became a battlefield, then who will benefit from that? That's my question.
Well, I think the first one was directed at me, and I think the second one maybe was directed to Van. When you think about deterrence here, if you think about what the United States has announced really just since January, just the past 4 months, I count 4 different efforts at deterrence that we could debate about whether they were effective or not. So announcing that North Korea was the actor in the Sony case and naming it, level number 1. The second was the announcement of economic sanctions in response to cyber. And I would guess put in that same category the indictment of the PLA officers. And there we could ask the question, are any of these effective? Thirdly, I think Van referred to, or Mr. Park referred to, the announcement of this new sanctions regime that would enable you basically to mount sanctions against individual cyber actors the way we do against people accused of terrorism or people accused of proliferation. And then the fourth was this new Pentagon strategy, which envisioned military response. So that's your escalation ladder. Now, you raise a very interesting question, which is, do the first 2 or 3 steps of that ladder actually amount to deterrence? And I have my doubts. Van?
I also have my doubts. If the behavior that we're trying to proscribe or prevent or deter is motivated by economic incentives, then there is power, or at least possibility, in the naming and shaming approach. So the indictment of PLA officers, right? If the motivation was economic. If it's other motivations, name and shame, I mean, that's not a form of deterrence necessarily, because you're being driven by other calculations other than just economic gain. So that's that. On the, did the U.S. militarize cyberspace, or are we militarizing cyberspace? I would just offer that we're being attacked every day. We rely on the web more than any country in the world, arguably. So in that sense, we're more vulnerable than anyone in the world, and we have to, we created cyberspace, but we have to protect it also. We have interests.
And not only did we create it and have to protect it, we launched, you could argue, if you believe what you read in the newspapers, probably the most sophisticated cyber attack on another state that had happened. So, as in the nuclear case, it's not as if American hands are clean here.
No, I think that's right. That's fair.
Mr. Park, you had something you wanted to say?
Briefly, I'd like to respond to the second question from the floor. One peculiar nature of cyberspace is the dual use for military and non-military purposes. And it has been mainly discussed on the military aspect of cyberspace, but cyberspace exists not only for military purposes, but also for human rights, digital privacy, and also economy, trade, digital trade. So we should think about how to use positively cyberspace from the military use of cyberspace.
Yeah, I'm Chen Jingwu, Senior Advisor to the Asan Institute. Nobody has explained why North Korea is so active in cyber attacks. So let me offer some comments. I think one reason is that the best talent, best scientific talent in North Korea goes into either cyber industry, missile technology, or nuclear engineering. That's where there is best North Korean scientific talent. And when these North Korean cyber experts graduate from colleges, they don't have any civil demand for cyber experts, only military demand. So all these people have nowhere else to work except for government, for the national security, for the military. So all they do, they have nothing else to do but hacking and cyber attacks. That's their job. And like, if we can have something like a non-Luger program to retrain the North Korean cyber experts into other more productive areas, maybe it could work, but I don't know what we can do
But
with
when
this.
they open up the Google office in North Korea, these guys will be ready to go. Yeah?
Oversupply of cyber experts, where there's no demand, no civil demand for North Korean cyber experts. That's one problem. Another is, just as our Chinese colleague, Professor Su, mentioned, supreme dignity, protecting supreme dignity in North Korea, supreme dignity of their leader. That's the highest mission for any North Korean, to protect the sanctity of their leader. This is higher than abiding by international norms and regulations. So that supersedes. So these two reasons, I don't think there is an effective deterrence against North Korean cyber attacks. What we will have to do is just to reinforce our cyber security. But I would be cautious in characterizing North Korean attacks as an act of war or anything like that, because even though internet is not yet very popular in North Korea, it's only accessible to institutions, government agencies, not to individuals. But in the future, I think there is a good possibility that internet connectivity will spread in North Korea. And ROK, US, Japan, all these countries are now under cyber attack from North Korea, have better cyber security than North Koreans. North Koreans are good at attacks, but they are not. Once they have their own infrastructure, I think they will be the most vulnerable country in the world when it comes to cyber security. And we have to save the option to use this cyber warfare against North Korea. And if we characterize North Korea's cyber attacks as an act of war, that could work against us in the future. That will deprive us of an option to use against North Korea. That's my comment.
Very good. We're going to take one more question here. That's right up there on the, and tell us who you are and direct the question out here, and then I'm afraid we'll be out of time.
Sinan Ülgen with EDAM in Turkey and Carnegie. I just want to push the panel of whether they would like to challenge one of the statements by the moderator initially, where, if I may paraphrase, David, you said that the arms control logic did not apply to cyber, essentially because there are many private actors who can engage in cyber attacks.
You said it hasn't yet, yes.
Yet, okay. However, in the discussion, we talked a lot about thresholds, we talk about norm making, we talk about whether we can characterize cyber attacks as cyber war. So I just want to get the thinking of the panel, whether that also reflects their thinking, or if not, what would be the best platform to start to talk about codifying, norm making around the concept of cyber war, whether that's something that the West, like the Tallinn Manual, should do among themselves, or is there room to engage other actors, whether it's China, Russia, in a more multilateral framework under the UN, for instance, to start to talk about what these needs to be and where that sort of effort for codification around cyber war can be carried out?
Renlin, this is sort of your territory, because as you mentioned before, there was an early effort to do this in the U.S.-China strategic dialogue.
Actually, I want to say, I didn't say much about the norm setting, regulation setting, because I am expert on that. But after heard all these dialogues concerning different logics that could apply in rule setting, regulation setting, etc., but somehow I'm confident to say that there should be dialogue among all the actors, not only Western countries, but also Asia countries as well. Not only great powers, of course, great powers in cyberspace have more capability to supply public goods, etc. There definitely need more communication, because if you say, somebody said that if the cyber attack, according to the economic logic, is acceptable, then what is happening a few months before that the Japanese car trade representative is detected by the U.S. firms, and the Japanese firms also feel frustrated concerning this. Hi, we are alliance. This is somehow the logic of economic. Then if the military logic could, if we apply this into the rule setting, norm setting, then it is also confusing, because we don't know exactly how could this kind of cyber war be possible. Cyber war cannot kill, but in word terms, it harms. We're not pretty sure about this. There are dialogues not only between the bilateral at the bilateral level between the U.S. and China, but also between the China and some European countries as well concerning cyber protection, cyber rights, etc. There are also some regional dialogues concerning cybersecurity, such as within the EU, also sometimes under the ASEAN dialogue. So I would say it is a word of global governance, but somehow in all these new fields, such as the cyberspace, we are not pretty sure about what is exactly the norms. Should we respect effectiveness of governance, or should we respect legitimacy of governance? What kind of a rule, to which ends do we need? Do we need effective governance in cyberspace, or do we need a legitimate governance in cyberspace? So I would hear more dialogues in the future, not only among what is so-called not only among the country actors, but also from the expertise, from the firms, what they would expect, what kind of rules and what kind of regulations they would demand to be discussed on the table. Thank you.
Dr. Parks, do you want to have the last word here?
As to the question about the international lawmaking on cyberspace and cyber war, cyberspace in nature is international and global. And then the critical question between states was whether existing international law applies or a new international law applies to cyberspace. But fortunately, from the international law perspective, there is a body called UN Group of Governmental Experts in Information Security. At the moment, the first UNGG is working, but In 2013, the third UNGG made a report by consensus and saying that existing international law applies to cyberspace. So in particular, with respect to cyber war, the current, in principle, current rules, such as jus ad bellum and jus in bello, they apply to cyber warfare. So that is a starting point among, US, Russia, China, and other countries.
Very good. Well, we have not come to the end of the subject, but we certainly have come to the end of our time. I think that this may be the first time that I can recall that we've had a panel at Asan that is just dedicated to this subject matter, which tells you a little bit about how the terms of conflict have changed a little bit in the region. I thank you very much. I think we've got about a 15-minute break before we come back for the last session of the afternoon.